everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome to the first of ResPublica's series of seminar stroke webinar events where we discuss the issue of poverty and inequality and the new Conservative response to that and to those issues. The hashtag for this event is hashtag Tories Against Poverty, which I hope you will agree is arresting as it is potentially thought-provoking. And that's what we wanted to do during these events, is gather friends and colleagues from across the range of political spectrum in the party and ask them what their ideas are to address not just those of deep poverty, but certainly those, but also those at risk of poverty. And what sort of new ideas can we have for this period when the Conservative Party has shifted to becoming the party of the working class? And I think it's fair to say that the policy cupboard in terms of the offer for constituencies that previously voted Labour is relatively bare. It isn't clear that we yet have an at-scale idea for meeting the needs of the new voters, the new electoral base of the Conservative Party. Indeed, we can discuss what their needs are and how we might benefit. No one, I think, disputes now the levels of inequality, poverty, or inequity, if I might put it like that, in the UK. We have some of the widest levels of inequality in the world, not least because of our economy and our opportunities are so centered around London and the Southeast. And class, which nobody talks about now, except some Conservative MPs, it must be said, remains our biggest penalty, way bigger than anything else. And class has metamorphosized with place. And so now we have all manner of place-based come class-based penalties. So much so that the level of distinction or difference between some places in the United Kingdom versus places, for instance, like between Blackpool and Richmond, mirror those between East and West Germany, mirror those between the poorest American states and the richest parts of America. So these are the issues that we have to address, and we have to address them in the light of the reality that we face and the context of the new settlement that's emerging and the new ideas. And I think it's fascinating to try and ask the big questions. You know, if one was sitting back and saying, what are the biggest innovations that have moved public policy in terms of operating against poverty in this country for the last, I don't know, let's say generation, some 20 years, what would they be? I often fear that the Conservative administration since 2010 favoured too much microtype interventions for very small groups of people who are identified as being on the margins, but they passed away like mist in the morning when the first rays of sun struck them. They have made no discernible difference at all. Whereas what has clearly made a difference, what has clearly shifted the dial at scale are things like, for example, compulsory enrolment in pensions, things like the minimum living wage, which structurally changed the outcomes for millions of low-paid workers and people. Things like, I mean, there's much dispute and discussion about the pensions triple lot, but it has had the effect of eliminating to a large extent, pensioner poverty. So what are the comparable ideas that we can think of at this moment in time? Could it be something like a revival of the child trust funds? Remember them, abandoned by the Osborne-Cameron government in their first year. The single most successful savings schemes for the poor, that was a match saving scheme from the government. Can we look at things like inheritance tax? Can we look at things like the impact of quantitative easing and how it's massively accelerated the gains of current asset holders? Can we look at things like housing? the most widely distributed asset, but therefore also oddly one of the greatest gaps between those who have housing and own it and those who don't. So we're at a very interesting point, I think, in conservative thinking and conservative policy. It's very clear that the old settlements, whether one agreed with them or not, are no longer fit for this new age that we're in. One might also argue that Brexit has played out quite differently. If you listen to the radio this morning about the shortage of workers, if there's ever anything designed to push up labour and the price of labour, it's Brexit. And all of those who argued that EU workers made no impact, the evidence looks quite firmly against them. So we are in a new paradigm. We do have a new Conservative Party. We have a Prime Minister that rightfully, in my view, has abandoned austerity. We have a state that has made a substantial difference during the COVID emergency. But what can we do post-COVID? What can we do at scale that would make a difference? Now, there's some kind of interesting points, I think, that we need to address and recognize if we're interested in these two things, poverty and those at risk of poverty. The recent work by the Social Metrics Commission has identified some worrying factors, that those in deep poverty, defined by them as 50% below the poverty line, has increased from 2001 from 2000 to 2001. 1.3 million more Britons experience deep poverty today than was the case 20 years ago. That's currently 4.5 million people are 50% below the poverty line. Largely, poverty for those levels above has remained 1 or 2% the same. The other great mark of poverty is if you have children. The largest rise has been in the percentage of working families with children, or if you have a disability. This is concerning. How can it be for a series of conservative administrations that the penalty for having children is quite so high and quite so pernicious? The same with being disabled. Anyway, I could go on, but I recognize my 10 minutes are near to an end. But I think what we should do today is ask deep questions about can we have a settlement that secures people? Because we live in an age now of new monopolies, enormous concentrations of corporate wealth, when the Conservative Party has done nothing on competition policy, nothing in terms of breaking up these big monopolies, and in places like in scenarios of gig workers, has allowed those concentrations of corporate power to exact great wage penalties on people who arguably need not experience them under a different form of governance or a different set of principles. So that is what the type of thing we want to address. And I couldn't really wish for a better group of people and MPs to join us on this. And I'll just briefly say thanks to Paul Maynard MP, Bob Blackman MP, and Steve Baker MP, all of whom are thinkers, all of whom want to pursue things radically at scale. I'm enormously grateful to them for joining the first of these sessions. I'm also grateful to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for sponsoring and resourcing these seminars. I would also just flag that we aim to collect the best of these contributions in a book, which we will publish at the end of our anti-poverty month. And we will try to organise around some of the best ideas and advocate for them in Parliament and through the policy process. But I'm also extremely grateful to Professor Becky Tunstall, who's joining us, whose expertise lies in housing, which is, of course, one of the most crucial assets in our country, but also give us a few general remarks about assets in general. And what I've asked the academics on the panel is just to give us an idea of general trends and things that we must look out for. So Becky, thanks once again for joining us, and over to you to set the scene, if you will.
Well, thanks very much, Philip, and thanks very much to ResPublica for developing this series. It's so interesting, and it's such a critical time for talking about these sort of ideas. So as you say, I'm going to start off talking about assets in general and homes as assets. So back to economics GCSE, assets are things that can provide flows of income or services or can be turned into capital. And clearly housing is one type of asset, although people always say it's a very special type, along with property, savings, pensions, and objects like gold watches and racehorses and so on. So in the most recent data, British households held £5 trillion worth of property. And as Philip has already said, housing is the main financial asset of most private households. So it's a very interesting thing for looking at wealth and assets and what people can and do with them. But it's worth noting that overall pension wealth has overtaken housing wealth in the last 10 years. So I do hope you have a session that looks at pensions in some depth as well. So housing is a financial asset, but it's a non-financial asset as well. It's the big support to child development, to the recreation of adult workers, and the place for our most important social relationships. And good quality, affordable housing can level up income inequality, or as we've all seen, it can even make a pandemic bearable. So housing wealth is used by individuals through remortgaging, downsizing, for extra spending, for gifts to children, and to pay for care, controversially. And it's continually raided in social policy thought experiments, such as we're all having today, to replace or add to welfare spending funded by tax. However, there are lots of problems with the concept of asset-based welfare in practice as a supplement or replacement for tax-funded welfare. You've got the basic economic arguments that you're all familiar with. Housing is a lumpy asset, it's illiquid, people actually live in it, so they can't just transform it into something else entirely. But I think it's also worth pointing out that housing can be a financial and non-financial liability. So mortgaged home ownership is debt secured on an essential. Housing costs eat into other spending, and that's a growing problem across the UK. Worries about housing quality, security, and cost have been shown to hurt mental health in a measurable way. And we've known for over 100 years that poor housing conditions can damage health and affect relationships and child development. And these sort of issues about housing as a potential liability are important to remember when we're trying to get people on low or insecure incomes into home ownership. Above all, though, that the problem for the social policy thought experiments is that housing assets are so very unequally distributed. So the Gini coefficient for property wealth in Britain is twice as high as that for income, although admittedly lower than for pensions or savings. And of course, a large and in fact growing minority of households have zero housing assets. Home ownership has been in decline unbelievably for almost 20 years, driven by a decline in people with mortgages. And the proportion of UK households who are non-owners has grown over the last 10 years from 30% to 34% or so. If you look at the distribution of wealth across the nation, the lowest tenth of wealthy people have negative housing equity, and the highest wealth tenth have £10 million each. Sorry, not 10 million, I mean £2 million each. But the other issues, so there's a very strong regional patterning, and if you're in the northeast, property wealth makes up a quarter of total wealth and pensions over half, but in London and southeast the figures are the other way around, and you can see that's going to make a lot of headaches for anyone trying to develop an asset-based social welfare policy. So one response to the implications of the inequalities in housing wealth is to try and make home ownership more affordable for people at the margin. But whether through right to buy or help to buy, it's expensive. It means more state support going into high-cost regions, which is the opposite of levelling up, piles risk onto either the state or individuals, and it may not create significant wealth when and where it's needed. And that's the question: what is the significant wealth we'd like everyone to have some of? So other approaches. Another approach would be to ensure that more people have the kind of incomes that can support mortgages. Another would be to ensure that renting can provide the same non-financial asset effects that you can get from good home ownership. And another would be to tax existing housing assets more. But I think it's also important to think about housing as a non-financial asset today. So let's look at the use value of housing. Even government ministers over the last 10 years have described the British housing system as, quote, broken and in crisis. But I'd like to present a different view, although I'm very concerned about housing problems and poverty. And there is a real problem of undersupply. Despite all these issues, the vast majority of the UK population are well housed and on average better housed than ever before. And even during these last 10 years of so-called crisis, there have been improvements. So the proportion of homes failing the decent home standard has fallen from a third to less than a fifth. More people have spare bedrooms, double glazing, energy efficiency measures. Now, it's true that households on higher incomes generally have better housing conditions, but the extent of difference varies. So if you're looking at the decent home standard, 84% of people in the highest fifth of incomes have decent homes, but the lowest fifth figure is only 80%, so it's not far behind. If you look at overcrowding, 5% of all households in the UK are overcrowded. And when it's the lowest fifth of income, the figure goes up to 10%. So it's a big proportionate change, but not a big absolute change. On the other hand, when you look at affordability, 15% of UK households are in unaffordable housing, spending more than 40% of their income on housing. But that jumps to half of all households in the lowest fifth of income. On some other measures, there's little difference between income groups, for example, who has central heating, double glazing, and so on. And the EU survey of income and living conditions shows that the UK has smaller difference in housing quality between rich and poor than many EU countries. And several researchers have commented on this, saying there's a weak relationship or non-existent relationship between poverty and housing deprivation. And the housing system, at least up until recent years, has been described by several as the saving grace of what is otherwise sometimes an ungenerous British welfare state. Now, social housing or affordable housing of various kinds and housing benefit have played a big role in this by matching people on low incomes into good quality housing. In other words, into non-financial housing assets. But there are inequalities and gaps. And one thing to note, perhaps linking back to what Philip was saying about lack of big ideas over the last 10 years, despite the improvement in housing conditions on average, these gaps haven't changed and opportunities for levelling up have been missed in recent years. Meanwhile, a small minority of people are in very bad housing conditions and falling further behind in relative terms. A growing minority are sleeping rough or in temporary or other insecure housing, and overcrowding is also on the rise. And if you think about it, over half the households in the UK are in private renting and mortgaged home ownership and are only secure if their income is secure, as the pandemic has shown. Yeah, the pandemic, it's been a massive shock to the housing system like everything else and has highlighted housing inequalities. So if you think about what's happened over the last year or so, people's ability to stay at home, to shield and isolate has been affected by housing issues, who they live with, how much space they have, the quality of housing they have, and by housing costs and security, which might push people out to work even if they were concerned and should stay at home. So housing inequalities have contributed to inequalities in infection and death over the last year or so. Another thing about the pandemic is it's also reminded us of the very large proportion of people who not only have no real housing wealth, but don't have a few £100s in the bank. And that's another issue about assets, perhaps a totally different category in thinking about developing thousands of pounds of housing equity. So just to come to a conclusion, I think we may be at a turning point in the development of the housing system, housing assets and housing issues of all kinds. The things that appear to have made the UK's housing system a saving grace are weakening. So social housing is shrinking, affordability is a very widespread problem, and housing benefit has been cut back. So it's my personal view. And in my view, shoring up the saving grace would be more valuable and practical than extending financial assets to individual home ownership. And even more important than that, I think making sure that most people have 1 month's income tucked away is more significant and more urgent than trying to give them some housing wealth. So thank you. I look forward to questions.
Oh, Becky, that was magisterial. Thank you so very much. Just because I think it's good to also pace between speeches. What strikes me about your remark is you seem quite suspicious of the idea of extending ownership, and I totally take your point about. I mean, indeed, we discussed beforehand about giving people the non-financial asset of housing security. You know, a more European approach to giving people security in rental. So not the assured. Not the Housing Act of 1988, etc. But I'm quite a fan of extending ownership because ownership gives you capital. I buy most of the additional externalities that people have written about for the last 20 years of owning. I take your point totally about housing can also be a liability. But shouldn't we be, I don't think Help to Buy is a particularly good scheme for extending home ownership, since it merely inflates house prices in areas where they're inflated anyway. But I do like the ideas that have been brokered recently about how we help people who are in long-term rent buy the homes they're in and compensate the owners. And we can use things like capital gains tax. I've often thought that those who don't own and have no chance of owning should be able to sell their capital gains tax. I forget the figure, but it's something like an enormous proportion of the British public never uses their capital gains tax relief. But that is an asset. And if you could make that transferable in the purchase of other assets, like, for instance, houses, so we could convert renters into homeowners. Is this not something one should explore? You don't just have to have a bad idea for helping to kind of people to buy homes. You can have a good idea, can't you, for extending home ownership?
Yes, indeed. I do think, though, before jumping in developing new schemes, it is worth thinking about why home ownership has declined. So we're in a very different position now to the 1980s, when there was fast growth in home ownership and the right to buy worked very well in its own terms. So what's changed over the last 20 years? There are just fewer households around in mortgageable jobs and mortgageable enough jobs to cope with the vast increase in house prices. So if you're interested in leveling up, you might want to do something about leveling down house prices, or else you just have to look at what's happened in labour markets. People are staying in education longer, they're developing debts in education. Are there those secure jobs around? So a lot of things have changed about the way households fund home ownership sustainably. And we really need to have a good look at those before developing any exciting new schemes, I think, to make sure we're getting value for money and we're targeting the right things. Because as you say, maybe labour market initiatives are what we need to change home ownership patterns.
I think that's very wise, and it's a wonderful segue. So thank you again. It's a wonderful segue into Bob Blackman MP, who has been a persistent and consistent and passionate advocate for increasing social housing, which might be part of your answer to your question, Becky. But anyway, I digress. Over to Bob. Bob, we've hopefully created the right platform for you. And thank you again.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Becky, for that lead in, I suppose, to my comments. And I'm going to be interested to hear my colleagues' views on how we combat poverty as well. I just want to paint the current position that we're at the moment. Obviously, the government have got a aim, an objective in the manifesto of building 300,000 new housing units a year, with a predominance on home ownership. You've mentioned Help to Buy. I may talk about that if there are questions about it. But I think the key point here is that we have a curious dilemma. At the moment, the position is that we sell our public land, publicly owned land, be it by local authorities, other public sector bodies. We assemble the land and then we sell it to the highest bidder. And then that land gets sold on and sold on, sold on, inflating land prices from the word go. Eventually, a developer will put a planning application in. They may sell the land with planning permission, whatever they may choose to do. And then eventually someone will actually develop on that land. So we have no constraints really once the land leaves the public sector at all on what developers choose to do with it. A lot of this is a lot of the concerns around land banking at the moment are precisely this, because land continues to increase in value until such time as someone actually develops on it. So it's a direct incentive to developers to either sit on it or which will then inflate on their balance sheets, or indeed get to a position whereby they sell the land for another inflated price. The end result of that is that then we get housing developed on the site. Often high density multi-story housing, properties that really people don't want to buy, but they're forced into buying because that's what's made available. Local authorities often object to what's being developed there, and actually we don't get the housing we want or need as a result. Worse still, we then get to a position whereby first-time buyers, if they buy a property on that site, will get a subsidy from the taxpayer through Help to Buy. So that inflates the prices once again. If someone buys it and rents it out, then the landlord will charge a market rent, whatever they can afford to achieve as a rental value. The people that move into those properties, of course, can't afford to pay the rent. So what they do is claim housing benefit. And then we end up with a housing benefit bill. At the moment, the current estimate is over £30 billion a year on this housing benefit bill to subsidise basically private tenancies, because that's where it goes. Now, at the beginning of the Conservative administration in 2010, a decision was made, and I'm not going to criticise that decision, but a deliberate decision was made to increase social rents to 80% of market rent. What that did, I'm afraid, is push an awful lot of people into housing benefit territory. So they get a subsidy from the public purse. Housing benefit is a very bad benefit in my view, indeed, because as a benefit, as you gain a job or your employment increases, you lose benefit pound for pound for your income. So there's no incentive for someone who is in a property with a high rental value where housing benefits picking up the cost to actually go out and work at all. Now, we're trying to get around this with universal credit by applying a housing element to universal credit. But of course, that then leads us to accusations of it not being transparent enough for the individuals who are claiming. So I have a solution to this, which I've been promulgating for the last few years, keep promoting to government ministers, to MHLG and the Treasury, because of the way this could work. So the first thing is we stop selling publicly owned land. Instead, we encourage local authorities within that area to design what should be built on the publicly owned land in terms of housing, which will cater for local housing need. Maybe family housing, it may be housing for individuals, it may be a mixture, but it will be designed, consulted upon by local authorities in the way that we would for a planning application in its own right. And then once that's agreed at a local level, then developers be invited to bid to develop on that site according to the plan that there is. And of course, the land ownership then doesn't leave the public sector. This is vitally important. Then the properties can be sold at a market price, which is commensurate with the cost of building. We could take into account the land value, but that's a different issue. But we would not have inflated land values. Equally, the rental would be fixed in proportion to the cost of developing the property instead of a market rent. Now, we'd have to do, it would vary by site, but we'd get to a position whereby the rental levels would be such that people would be unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely to qualify for housing benefit. So we have the virtue then of people paying a rent out of their salaries, wages, that they could afford, and equally have the if they go out to work and they actually get further income, then actually they'll be rewarded for doing so instead of penalised as happens in under housing benefit. Equally, in order to reinvigorate the right to buy, tenants moving into this social housing would be given the opportunity to buy the home at a time of their choosing at the price it would be on the day they move in. So if they choose to exercise the right to buy in 5 years' time, it would still be the same price if they chose 10 years' time. So instead of complicated discounts, they would know they would be able to buy that property at a fixed price. And then all the proceeds from the sale of that property would then get reinvested in new housing. It'd be a virtuous circle. Equally, we have the situation, of course, where a public body would say, well, hang on, wait a minute, we were counting on selling that land for a capital receipt. So my solution to that is that there'd be agreed market price for that land, and the Treasury would compensate the public body with the value of that land without it getting into a inflationary price war. This would then lead us to a position whereby we could generate between 90 and 100,000 units a year of social housing that could be used for families, for different people. And we have the added attraction of it being locally determined of the type of housing that's provided. So it's the housing that people want and need, as opposed to what developers want to provide. So as I say, I've been mentioning and talking about this for several years, because the reality is that where we're getting to now is a very unholy position of creating poverty where it doesn't need to exist. And I think this would be an ideal way of encouraging a property owning democracy so that people could go into shared ownership. They may choose to carry on renting if they so choose. But at the same time, they'd be in a position whereby once their circumstances allow, they would be able to buy. Now, because site by site would be a potential challenge, and there'll be big sites and small sites and such like, in my judgment, a body such as Homes England or a successor body should be the one driving this forward. It needs to be driven from the centre to encourage it to take place, to encourage public sector bodies to declare land surplus to requirements for housing, but in the surefire knowledge that it would be housing that would be commensurate with the local area. I think this is something that is a localist agenda. It's good news in terms of preventing poverty, and indeed it promotes the position of which we all like to see is the property owning democracy. At the same time, we would have to make sure that local authorities do not do what they currently do, and that's create housing companies to avoid the position of allowing right to buy. Because I think it's very important that people have the opportunity of claiming a stake in society. One of the reasons why our right to buy program in the 1980s was so successful was because people had been paying rent for donkey's years and had no stake in their property. Suddenly, they had an opportunity to buy at a discount commensurate with the fact they'd been paying rent for a long time. Unfortunately, I think in many ways, those properties aren't being built these days, but we do need that development to take place. And my criticism of Homes England at the moment is they do the site assembly and then they sell to the highest bidder. They don't drive the development of new housing that we need for the sake of housing people that need it. So that is my synopsis. I'll stop there, take any questions. I've yet to find anyone who comes up with a reason why this is not a good conservative idea to combat poverty.
Thank you very much, Bob. We've discussed your idea beforehand. It's somewhat similar to the ideas we at ResPublica propose through our housing fund, and I think we propose roughly the same thing, that in effect we could generate equity returns for people by letting them buy the house at the value when they started a secure rental. So we create capital from nothing. And I think why I like this idea is I don't actually even think it needs to be public land. The model works even on land you buy, and you can even suppress the price of that land. We modeled something similar through our National Housing Fund. I went to see Philip Hammond. We took it through Treasury, and perhaps like yourself, nobody could really object to it because it's self-financing. And what I like about this proposal as well is that it enables you to, for instance, to offer NHS staff or teachers, yeah, a pathway to ownership. So we can start to level up in these areas and say, look, we can offer you a place on the estate. And then the interesting thing, the difference, I think, why I think it's also can use, I agree with you about public land, but also can use private, is we argued that the major problem with British house building was speed and scale, that essentially builders could only finance the building of 2 or 3 houses because they'd have to sell them before they could get the next amount of money to put in. Whereas you could easily build out an entire site in a couple of years if the funding was available from the outset to do that. And then you do, as you quite rightly say, you have a mix of sales, rentals, and purchases. The other interesting idea I think that you're also proposing is it reminds me of those military retirement villages that you go to where you always have to sell 20% below market rate. Yes. And the difference is recycled into the community, which is not something we propose, but I also think it's an interesting idea. So I'm broadly in favor, and I don't see why that has never taken off, because we proposed it. It's actually been adopted by various local authorities, and it produces an enormous amount of funding for social good. But I'll just turn to Becky. Becky, what do you think of Bob's proposal? Any sort of immediate reflections on it? I'm as you can tell, so I'm not hiding it. I'm broadly enthusiastic, I must admit. But what are your thoughts, Becky? Becky, you need to unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm enthusiastic too. I think we need more affordable housing, and this is a very effective plan for doing it. It's a very sensible, reasonable, workable plan. And as you say, I think one of the questions is why people aren't picking up on it more. And the way that you've built the right to buy in sounds, really creative and very solid. So
what I think we could do, Bob, and is try perhaps to merge our efforts, given I think we're in broad alignment with ResPublica, and let's meet afterwards and see if we can't press again at the policy gate again.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Philip, that this could apply to privately owned land as well. Yeah. But the key point here is to stop the sale of publicly owned land to the auction that takes place to the highest bidder, because as soon as you've got the land, then because that inflates land prices and therefore inflates all the property prices completely unnecessarily. And by doing this, the other attraction is, of course, that it has zero impact on the value of existing properties, and that's very important as well.
I'd also like to do, Bob, if I may, sorry to speak across you, is I think your point about housing benefit is a very astute one. It'd be very interesting modelling, kind of, modelling if indeed significant housing benefit savings accrue, because that's something we didn't model in when we modeled something similar. So I think that's a fascinating aspect. Anyway, if I can just flag again to those watching, please do ask questions. You're already doing it on the Q&A system. If you could make them questions rather than statements of anger or agreement, that would be useful to friends and colleagues online, and then we will ask them. But Bob, I said I was going to ask one question after every session, just to break it up a little thank you for your contribution. I think really fascinating. Now we go to Paul Maynard, who's up in sunny, glorious Bristol. And Paul and I have been having very interesting discussions about how we can help people with other forms of assets, not just housing. So I will hand over to Paul. Paul, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and I was pleased to see in our introduction you contrasting Blackpool and Richmond, not least because I first took a parliament in Twickenham in the London Borough of Richmond, which was the 8th richest constituency in the country. And I came to Blackpool in 2010, which is not the 8th richest in the country. Indeed, my seat is the second most deprived Conservative held seat, and the adjacent Blackpool South holds the unfortunate title of the most deprived Conservative held seat. So I have seen in my parliamentary career both ends of the spectrum, to put it mildly. Many politicians come to Blackpool for conferences, and if you go back to 1951, which I'm sure most of us can't now recall, and I looked at the press coverage in the local paper of the 1951 conference, half the cabinet were speaking at various venues in my constituency, however small, you know, tiny corner shops, Conservative clubs, what have you. I've been out to that conference, and they were all talking about housing. Housing was the issue that dominated that 1951 election. It's strange that housing doesn't dominate elections now, and much of what Barbara's been saying, I think, is an interesting perspective on how we can bring that back front and centre of what we talk about as a party. We're doing an awful lot. The one thing we don't seem to be discussing, which might be an entirely separate section, is why we are creating households faster than we are creating houses, and that's fueling demand. I'm not a great big intervener in social policy, but it is something I've always noted with interest, that we don't seem to tackle the demand side of the programme, and the problem rather, if you like. Fantastic results in Hartlepool, but we pulled a very simplistic conclusion from it. The more homeowners you create, the more people vote Conservative. Stands to reason. I wasn't entirely sure that that was the conclusion I drew from slopping around the streets of Hartlepool on a few sunny days. It struck me more that it was the older owner-occupiers who were severing the umbilical cord of Labour for the final time. Those fraying ties were never to be reconnected again. It was not to do with a younger generation who may be getting on the housing ladder, who suddenly turn into Conservatives overnight. And if I look around Blackpool, and I see we have well above average private rented sector here in Blackpool, they're spending all their income on rent. And that will have the interesting consequence of when they cycle through the generational tumble dryer, then they emerge into their pensioner years, that they will not have addressed the issue of pension and poverty that Philip thinks has been addressed at the moment, and that might more come back as a bigger issue in 25 to 30 years' time, more interestingly. But I'm not here to talk about housing. I'm here to think more about how we help people build assets that are not housing-based. I'm always concerned that people with no assets or on fixed incomes are very decoupled from what happens both with the economy and indeed with the overall effectiveness and efficiency of government. And how we give people a stake in the future in how the government is run is, I think, really important for a democracy to be vibrant and functioning. And it stops people focusing on side issues rather than focusing on what would be actually best for the country as a whole. We're not going to be recreating, however much we might like to, the popular capitalism of the Sid era. I think that, you know, has been and gone. We're going to have interesting discussions around how we can give people a stake in more of their community assets, not necessarily financially, but a stake in their sense of place in their local community. But my key focus is on how we can help people address some of the weaknesses in their own personal finances, helping people out of debt, keeping those at risk of going into debt from not going into debt in the first place. And if people have greater financial confidence in meeting the unexpected, that will give them more options to choose how best to structure their own work, one of the great lessons of post-war Britain is this gradual diminution of agency and autonomy in the lives of most working people. They have less and less choice over how they work, how that work is structured, and then what that means for the choices open to them in their own lives. I want to try to recreate that, I think, as well. It's amazing to think that most, or rather low-income families have on average some £95 in savings. 40% of those in the age group at 20 to 29 have no savings at all. That's a frightening statistic that has real consequences. It's what creates the poverty premium, a phrase I absolutely hate, but that's what people call it. And if you think about it, if you don't have a cooker, because the cooker blows up or whatever, and you can't afford to replace it, that means you're relying on takeaways for several nights. And maybe the weekly finances don't stretch that far. And maybe you find yourself having to go to a food bank at some point to meet that gap in your provision. If you don't have a washing machine, you might well find yourself having to go to the laundrette, paying £4 a load, and then £3 for the tumble dryer, when your average home wash is just 25 pence. So, trying to address this, I've been running a campaign to reform local welfare assistance, which is the government scheme to help address people suddenly lacking that crisis money. But surely it's a better use of government money to try and forestall that need in the first place, give people that financial buffer, so that the government doesn't need to ride in as emergency assistance when the unexpected strikes. Government's tried lots and lots of ideas in this space. We've just started introducing what's called a breathing space for those who are trying to restructure their debt. A lovely idea, but actually fatally flawed. Here's my statistic of the week now. A charity called TaxAid looked at debt people owe to HMRC. And we very rarely quibble with a HMRC debt. If you've got any sense, most people just accept defeat and pay. They found they did the work on those payments that were owing and found that 80% of them were not actually owing. They were HMRC errors. But breathing space is actually about debt advice, not tax advice. And at no point do they check whether a particular debt is owing or not. So to me, breathing space is missing out an entirely separate portion of how we can improve matters. Then we've got piloting no interest loans. They've been great in Australia. I'm looking forward to seeing how they go. And then we have help to save. That should be our, flagship policy in this regard. But it's, although we have access to work, one of our best kept secrets. The idea is that for every £1 you save, the government contributes 50 pence. You can save a maximum of £50 a month for a maximum of 4 years. You need to be on low incomes to do this as well, incidentally. There are over 250,000 accounts. Wonderful, you might think. 50,000 of them have never had a single deposit, though. So when government trumpets a figure, you need to ask for how many have actually had money put into them. The good thing is the average deposit is £48 a month, so at the very top end of the spectrum. But it should be millions and millions of people participating in a scheme like this, not just a small sliver of 250,000. We've got plenty of voluntary community savings schemes, from your street level Christmas fund to credit unions, but they all require a voluntary decision to opt in. There is none of this nudge theory, if you like, that encourages people to opt into particular schemes because it's easier to opt in than to opt out. That, I think, is always a virtuous circle that you can create. Now, ministers have spoken of replicating what we've done for workplace pensions with what they're calling a sidecar savings scheme, a very similar idea. But once again, that's for people who are in work. And I asked a question, and I've been thinking about this, how can we build in that same mechanism for those who are not in work or are in very, very, very low paid work, reliant upon UC or other state benefits? How can they also be helped to create that financial buffer? Maybe the answer lies in a similar system to help to save, that if they put a proportion of their benefit payments into some sort of cash ISA perhaps, then government will meet or match or contribute a similar amount into that same ISA. Doesn't need to be the same ratio as 50 pence to a pound, as in help to save. Now, of course, there are going to be immense perverse incentives within that, unintended consequences potentially, but we need to think through how we best use state assistance to people in need. There are so many income streams going towards more vulnerable in society, not just the traditional benefits. People are owing billions to the GWP in various forms of debt that need to be paid back, at the same time as the DWP giving them different streams of income to enable them to afford to repay debt. It seems to go round and round in circles. How do we break that cycle, allow people to keep more of what they have, yes, but build it up in such a way it gives them a financial buffer? Asset accumulation, in my view, should be for everyone. It's a good thing. It gives people a stake in the future. It isn't about the state spending more money. It isn't about big state, small state. I characterize it as the big cis state, if you like. Someone sitting beside you who occasionally tells you a few home truths, but in addition is there when you need them most. And that, to me, I think is the right sort of dynamic that assists people most, to get them back on their own 2 feet, to help them take a bit of responsibility for their own lives, but doesn't just say, well, we're taking the safety net away, let's see whether you bounce or not, and then they're surprised when they don't bounce back up. So that's my, rather, I've got 10 minutes already gone, that's my vague sense of idea anyway as to how we go about this, focusing on those at the bottom of the pile in the most persistent poverty, how they can also be helped and encouraged to build up their own asset base so they have that comfort when they need it most as well.
Thank you so much, Paul. And you know, it's so lovely to hear kind of that level of insight, especially as you say, from the second most deprived Conservative held constituency. Also sounds like you speak for all of the deprived constituencies there. And I know I've flagged this before, I completely agree with the idea of buffer and savings, and all the surveys show that people are crippled by even a small you know, to household essentials, and the prospect of trying to apply for help to meet them is terrifying, you know, for people. How can we, though, so to speak to your own measure, how can people who have so very little save a proportion of that would make a significant difference to them over time? You know, is there another way of trying to think the sort of contribution that might be made, you know, that is more generous than 50%? I don't know. What are your thoughts? Can we, in some sense, pay them in kind for voluntary work? I don't know. What's your sense for? Because what I fear is if we expect something too small and we give an even smaller share of something too small, it just won't be enough. But your thoughts on that, please.
So it's a fair point that for many who are on benefits, they simply do not go far enough in the first place, and they are left short at the end of the month. There's no point denying that. We can analyse all the reasons why that might be. Everybody has their own individual story. I've learned never to make a blanket assessment of those in need as to why they are in need. However, I think every little helps, to coin a phrase. Many of my constituents rely upon the jam jar approach to saving, putting a few coins in each jam jar for a different set of bills. So even if that saving is only £2 or £3 a month, it still mounts up over time. So I wouldn't dismiss that, but I think you're right, we need to be more creative over how we help people build these assets. Is it that when we come around to announce each year's benefits uprating, that we look at how we allocate those benefits increases? Should they be, if we were to choose to give an above inflation benefit increase, could part of that go towards building up this buffer? I think the political battle right now is to win the argument that these people need that financial buffer in the first place. The entire political debate on both sides of the spectrum is how do you meet need, not how do you remove need in the first place. There's a lack, I think, of imagination on the part of the political classes, because we never have to face these challenges. I've never had to face my washing machine exploding in the middle of a spin dryer cycle, but my constituents have, and that puts them in crisis very, very easily, because for want of £95, which is the average savings.
That's really interesting. Becky, I don't want to cut Steve or short or any of the questions, but a quick remark on match savings and kind of any swift thoughts on them.
Well, I'm also extremely concerned about the large portion of the population who are, have got no savings whatsoever and have nothing to keep them from crisis, other than going to universal credit, which takes a long time, and so on. Yeah, I think the idea of opting out instead of opting in sounds great. You could have savings club membership at the bottom of the universal credit form. And people are able to do little bits of saving, and people do little bits of lending to each other while they're in terrible financial straits. So if word got around and people realized that it could build up and be useful and it wouldn't be counted against them in any of their applications, I think it's a great idea.
Here's a thought. What about not counting for the universal credit taper anything put into the savings account?
Yeah,
that's not a bad idea.
Not at all, and it's not going to be expensive because we're talking about small amounts of money.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So then you get 100% of what you might earn. Anyway, let's park that. Thank you very much, Paul. Fascinating as ever. And we move now to Steve Baker MP, who again has been one of the brightest intellectual forces in the party, and he and I have discussed ideas for years now, and I think it's fair to say we agree on some, we disagree on others. We discuss political philosophy, and I always learn, and it's always illuminating, and I'm very grateful to him for joining us once again. So Steve, you've managed to focus on one of the most important issues, of which there's much debate, as you well know, which is what is the impact of quantitative easing on inequality and on assets. And I think this is so interesting because whenever we discuss poverty, we never discuss macroeconomics. We kind of discuss applied economics. We don't do the big overarching kind of positions that actually determine so much. So I'm very grateful again to Steve for focusing our minds quite rightly on this. So over to you, Steve.
Well, Philip, thanks very much. And likewise, I always learn something from you. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here. And I want to try, if I may, to refocus my remarks around what's already been said. I mean, you particularly opened up talking about inequity, levels of inequity in the UK. You talked about concentrations of wealth and monopolies. And in particular, you said that the old settlement is not fit. And as so often, I do agree with you. You talked about the need to be radical and at scale. And I suppose the problem I've faced for 10 years is I've talked about this issue of monetary policy, and it sounded too radical. I've always aimed, I have to say, to be radical only in my moderation. But, talking about monetary reform does sound radical, but it is, of course, at a massive scale. It's the whole economy. I want to come back, and I hope Paul will remind me if I forget, to his jam jar approach to saving, because it will help me illustrate a really important point. Money is, of course, at the heart of everything that we do. And I want to try and illustrate both the jam jar saving and the housing problem with reference to money creation and QE and how money is normally created. And I want to try and keep it simple. And I hope people who do know a lot about this, who might be watching, will bear with me, because in the past I've made it complicated and not been very successful. So I'm going to try and keep it simple. I would like everyone, please, to imagine a paddling pool. Let's suppose it's sort of mid-calf depth, and it's shaped the size of the United Kingdom, shaped to the shape of the United Kingdom. And you can get into this paddling pool and you only get wet up to the middle of your calf. But in the position of London, I want you to imagine an enormous fountain. And this fountain is gushing water. And of course, the nearer you get to it, the wetter you get, until when you're in London, you're absolutely soaked through. Now, what I want to put to you is that this is one of the reasons why we end up with regional inequality, because the way the monetary system works is money is created overwhelmingly when banks lend, and more recently through QE. And that creates a fountain of new money in London. And that then spills out into house prices in the southeast, and on it goes. Now, just to give you some simple illustrations, I left the Air Force, Royal Air Force, as an engineer officer in 1999. Gosh, it feels a long time ago now. And I more or less doubled my pay by going into software engineering. I then doubled my pay again by going from software engineering in Oxford to software engineering in the city. And I just mentioned that's just one illustration. House prices are another. Another one would be that you look at the pay that people have in banks. I don't mind people earning a high salary, of course I don't. But you look at the sheer scale of the pay you get. If you're a mid-level managing director in a big investment bank, you can be up on, you know, £500,000 a year for managing, admittedly, large and complex software systems that shift a lot of money. But that's the crucial point. When you're around large quantities of money being shifted about, your little share of it becomes a very large amount of money. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. To give you another illustration, imagine you're playing Monopoly, and the median person playing Monopoly goes past go and gets £200. But some people who really know how to play the system go past go and get £1,000. Some people who really don't know what they're doing go past go and get 10 or 20. Again, the point I'm trying to illustrate is it really matters how the system works, because if the system is set up institutionally so that there isn't equity in the social processes at work, then you're bound to have inequity in the outcomes. And that's really the point I'm trying to illustrate, that the money conversation, the issue of how money is created and how it works, is absolutely foundational to social processes in a market economy. So where does money come from? Well, normally money is created when banks lend. Now, forgive me if you know this already, and if you don't believe me, please Google for money creation in the modern economy by the Bank of England, because they explain it very clearly, and that's the Bank of England, so they must be right. When a bank extends mortgage credit, they do not lend the money that has been deposited. There's this fallacy that money comes into a bank and then gets loaned out again. That isn't what happens. What happens is, on the balance sheet, a bank creates a mortgage, which from their point of view is an asset, and simultaneously creates bank deposits, which from their point of view is a liability. So they balance on the balance sheet. But what the bank has done is create money when they lend. Now, there's a very old school of economic thought, and to really get into it, you have to go back to pre-Keynesian days. I happen to have picked up a book. Don't worry, I'm not going through it all, but here's one example. And really try and get into these issues that if you create money at a particular point in the economy, what does that do to the individual's purchasing power when they receive it? So to try and just fast forward then, we know we've just had a terrible economic crash. And yet look at the FTSE, if I can. This is, I hope you can just broadly see the shape of it, but here is the precipitous crash at the beginning of the pandemic, and then back comes the stock market. Now, I would put it to you, and I mean, by the way, to raise more questions here than I answer, but I would say to anyone watching this, have a look at how maybe if you've got stock savings in stocks, or you otherwise watch the stock market, ask yourself why it was that stock markets came back up faster than our GDP recovered. You know, we still all had, at a time when we had terrible economic prospects, the stock markets were recovering. What does that mean for wealth inequality? Let me just read you a summary of QE, because this has been very relevant. So before the coronavirus crisis, the stock of bond purchases since 2009 stood at £435 billion. I hope everybody watching this will think that that is an enormous sum of money. So before coronavirus, 435 billion. Once these currently authorised purchases are complete, QE will stand at 875 billion, plus 20 billion in corporate bonds. So that's 895 billion pounds. That's an awful lot of money. Just to take you through the history, March 2020, the Monetary Policy Committee went for 200 billion. Just only June 2020, they went for a further 100 billion. Then November 2020, a further 150 billion. And then in May 21, they voted to continue with that 150, but Andy Haldane decided it should be slowed a bit. What happens? If you look at, but again, don't have to take my word for it, have a look at the OBR's documents. But what happens is that the Debt Management Office issues government bonds. They're bought by private players in the market, and then those private players sell the bonds on to the Bank of England. Now, this is a very important distinction because the Bank of England isn't directly funding government, and they are most emphatic about that. And yet, even members of the Monetary Policy Committee have been really clear in drawing comparisons and contrasts with the likes of Zimbabwe and the Weimar Republic, being, and I mean MPC members, you can find their speeches, but they've been really clear that the difference between our situation and those situations is that the MPC is independent. What does that mean? It means that everyone can understand that if inflation picks up, the bank will adjust monetary policy, that is, buy fewer bonds, possibly raise interest rates. And that, I would put it to you, will have a profound effect on the public finances. But that's not the main thing I'm here to say. The main thing I want to say to you is, please start imagining, I'm trying to use this fountain analogy, try to imagine what it means to create so much new money and inject it into the economy with some participants getting the benefit of that new money first. If you can just see the shape of this chart here, which has a flat line and then goes vertical. This is a price index by the House of Commons Library and the Office for National Statistics. So impeccable sources, a price index back to 1750. So you get a flat line through to about 1900, little blip through the wars, and then about 1971, it goes vertical. I don't want to get into too many features of this chart. The main thing, two things I want to say to you is that this monetary environment where the price index is basically collapsing is profoundly different to this monetary environment. Now, people will say to me, oh, but think of all the progress we've had here. But between 1800 and 1900, there was actually quite a lot of industrialization. You might argue about whether it was all good. There are lots of things happened we didn't like, but there was certainly a lot of commercial progress in this period with a profoundly different monetary environment. To come back to Paul's jam jar savings point, if I haven't got it to hand, but if I put this chart on a log scale so you could see the detail here, you would have found that if somebody was saving in a jam jar and they put £1 in 1800, it would actually buy, it would fluctuate in its value, but it would buy a little bit more in 1850 and 1900 than it bought in 1800. So if you are a poor person doing jam jar saving, would you rather be in this monetary environment or that one, where the pound saved the year that I was born, 1971, will now buy incomparably less than what it buys today? So I could show you all sorts of graphs and charts that I have over the years. I've just gone back and checked my regional distribution of house prices. I will show it to you, even though it's slightly out of date. I've only done it, this one goes back to 20. I last updated this in 2013. But the point I want to make here is if you look at the different regions of the UK, Greater London at the top, Scotland at the bottom, you do see quite clearly the regions separate out. And that's why I was making the point about the paddling pool, the shape of the UK. What I want to put to you is that it really matters in terms of the justice of social processes, how money is created, and where you stand in relation to that money creation, in particular in relation to working for the state, because so much money is created when the government borrows, particularly at the moment because of QE, and also in relation to the financial system and housing, because of the incredible degree of financialization of assets. We just saw the Green Seal debacle, which is another subject, but it's like everybody wants to financialize everything, from cars to mortgages to invoice financing. Everybody wants to skim their little percentage off the side of this enormous great slew of credit going round the sides. Well, where does that leave people like Paul's constituents who are struggling to do some jam jar saving to pay for their washing machine? Now, I don't want to draw too many inferences from that because they're not obviously about to go and start working in the city. But I do want to provoke this conversation about how does money work. And in case anybody thinks it's all just down to QE, if you can just see this chart here, which has obviously got broadly an exponential increase. This is actually from 1982. This is the broad money stock from 1982 to 1982 to 2010. And then it starts again, it's a very different monetary environment after the crisis. But the point I'm making is we had this accelerating rush to destruction of money being created as credit as we went into the financial crisis.
And
So I want to give you a solution in order to finish. When I first got into politics, all I could offer you was this howl of despair that there's this problem. But since then, something's profoundly changed. And that's, I think we're going to get a money reform almost for sure. And that is that we're going to find that we're using central bank digital currencies. Now, it's not the money reform I expected. I think cryptocurrencies haven't become money like people thought, Bitcoin and so on. But actually, the central banks around the world have worked out that they could have more control of the money supply and more visibility potentially of what we do with the money that we have through central bank digital currencies. And those central bank digital currencies are going to mean that this conversation about money, how it's created, who creates it, who benefits, where the money flows, these are all going to become very real aspects of our public conversation as that monetary system changes. That, I would put it to you, gives us an opportunity to all of us, all the brilliant minds on this call, to actually think maybe Steve's completely wrong, but maybe he's got a point that it matters how money's created and where it flows, in which case we've got an opportunity to solve some of these problems and have a more just social system as central bank digital currencies are introduced. But of course, the risks and dangers and questions involved are both radical and at scale, as Philip put it. But at the moment, I'm quite excited that if we proceed, as it were, with caution, we might achieve some great things for the justice of social processes over the next few years.
thank you so much, Steve. I mean, it is a fascinating question, and I know there was quite a lot of debate around QE. But actually, what QE did is vastly inflate the prices of assets, and by inflating the prices of assets, widen even more the sort of equality gap. Now, I think part of that is because if you've got assets, you can issue debt, which will enable you to buy more assets. You know, and that's I think you're making quite a subtle point here about who's in the knowledge economy and able and well positioned enough to benefit from that. I've read Bank of England responses that claim there's no such evidence that QE inflates assets, but I think the balance, if I can put it, is that actually it does, because not least because it aids financialization and aids those that are already in that position.
But Philip, if I may, to pick up on two things in that. One is that usually when I've raised this with them on the record, they very quickly pivoted away from the conversation and instead replied that it all would have been much worse if we hadn't done QE. That's typically over the 10 years been their response. Imagine the unemployment and the suffering which would have followed if we hadn't done QE, which is an excuse, not an engagement with the set of problems. The other point I would put to you, or to anyone listening, is at the moment you can pick up any newspaper more or less any day and find signs of inflation, and yet inflation's not in the measure which the Bank of England is targeting. And just try it for yourself, pick up some newspapers and have a look at various reports of prices surging. And prices seem to be surging everywhere except in the measure the bank is targeting. And it's the old Nelson problem, I see no ships. In the rush into the last crisis, we said we'd inadequately looked at at house prices. So now we have a measure CPIH, which includes house price with housing costs, but it only includes rental and mortgage costs. It doesn't include the asset price. And the result of that is that all the time interest rates are suppressed by bank policy. That measure also sees no ships.
So what I think, and apologies if I haven't discerned this correctly, you're arguing with digital currency, which is part of the claim for digital currency, a wider distributional effect, that more people in effect can issue their own currency. So we might distribute that fountain, to use your
Well,
metaphor, more widely.
so in a sense, that's how Bitcoin works. Now because of the way Bitcoin is mined by computers, it's too late for this to work. But at the beginning of Bitcoin, you could set your computer going at home, and you could generate your own Bitcoin, and that would distribute the money creation process. But the way without getting into it, the way Bitcoin is generated slows down. It's like the supply schedule of gold, and very deliberately so. And so it's now much harder to mine Bitcoin. But actually, with central bank digital currencies, what we should expect is not the distributed creation of money, because that would obviously create chaos, as we all saw. Without rules, we'd all seek to have a winning lottery ticket. What we should expect is central banks to be controlling the issuance of money very carefully and very directly, because at the moment they use levers which are often very indirectly connected to what happens in the economy. But with central bank digital currencies, this is the crucial innovation, the thing that really matters to this conversation about inequity and justice and poverty and wealth inequality, is with central bank digital currency, we'll all be able to see what they're doing. In a sense, the magic curtain will be torn away. And instead of having all of this language around what happens in markets and how banks function, and talk about capital adequacy, and talk about QE and so on. Instead, we'll just be able to see how much central bank digital currency they created and where it was spent.
I think this is a fascinating point, and it takes us to the debate between helicopter money and QE. And the debate is, if you remember, during the time of the financial crisis, to get demand going again, it's much better just to give everybody the cash, rather than this privileged inside rank that's able to access QE. But this is now a moot point in respect of.
Yeah, it is. But there are people who talk about something called modern monetary theory. And early in this conversation, I noticed one of the first Q&As, social welfare doesn't have to be funded by tax. This is a choice, was a question. Well, I'd love to know more about what the questioner meant by that, because some people want to spend all the money we need. Now, you have to ask, well, what will that do to prices and inflation? And again, justice and equity in a market.
I want to bring in the questions. I've noted to Mike the questions that I'd like to flag. We've had some fascinating remarks on savings, fascinating remarks on kind of macroeconomic policy. We've got a lot of interest around housing, so I think we'll begin with them. Mike, can you bring in the first person to ask the question? So I'd ask them to unmute. If they're not there, I'll happily read out the question. So Mike, can you bring them in, please?
I think that Jane Hewland, who asked one of the first questions, is not longer attending.
I will ask this. So this is from Jane, and it's quite interesting around the current leasehold dispute. You haven't considered the question of tenure. Both shared ownership and leasehold are not actually ownership, but a form of lengthy tenure, which, as the cladding scandal shows, traps people paying bills they can't afford in unsellable flats. Help to Buy has been more a way of transferring tax money into the hands of house builders. Can we rethink tenure? Is that something you're interested in, Bob, in order to give it more of a shape of ownership? And please, Paul or Steve, if you want to comment on that.
It is, and I just draw the distinction between leasehold houses, standalone houses, and leasehold flats, because obviously in a block of flats you've got a different arrangement with a number of leaseholders compared to a house where there is basically one leaseholder and one freeholder. Obviously, what the government has done is to make clear that having leasehold houses in future will not be allowed legally. But there are still a large number of leasehold houses still in existence. And when individuals go through the process of buying the freehold from the freeholder, depending on who the freeholder is, it can end up being very expensive. This has been highlighted, of course, by the scandal of the ground rent, and particularly the increasing ground rent that has applied to properties. So I think that has to be dealt with going forward. Equally, I think there's got to be a decision made. And I don't have a solution to this right now, but what we do about historical leasehold properties, which are houses. On flats, I think the position clearly is one where we should be promoting common hold, so that all the owners of the flats, of the leaseholds of the flats, would have an equal share in the freehold of the property. Now there are, one of the problems here is that this is not a simple position, as I've discovered when we were looking at this particular issue around cladding and fire safety and such like. But clearly we need to get to a position whereby common hold is encouraged. There is a drawback to this, of course, in that if leaseholders enter into common hold arrangements, they take on a shared responsibility. Now, not everyone wants that shared responsibility, and there would be an issue, for example, where say you had 20 flats in a block of flats, and one or two of those individuals said, well, I'm very happy being a leaseholder, thank you very much. I don't want to be part of the common hold. There'd have to be a solution for how that was resolved. But I do think we should be ending this position of having leaseholders. One of the things we've discovered during the crisis over cladding and such like is that freeholds are owned by many different companies, by many different environments. There are companies like Bellway, for example, who build blocks of flats and then sell the freehold of those blocks of flats to finance companies who then exploit the position of the ground rent and other conditions within it. And Bellways don't even inform the leaseholders they're doing it. I mean, it is a complete scandal, I have to say, which should be rectified in law. But this is absolutely horrendous. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how difficult and complicated this is, because different leaseholds are of varying different lengths of period of time. They have different conditions within the contracts, etc. So it's not an easy one to have a simple solution to resolve. But as I say, houses, no question, it should be freehold only, unless we get into what we've been talking about, allowing local public bodies to control the land going forward. But on blocks of flats, common hold is the solution.
Thank you very much, Bob. I have a question for you, Paul. I'm going to read them out just for the sake of swiftness. This is from Angela Lockwood. I'll put the question first to Paul, but colleagues can quickly come in. Does the panel think a universal income might be part of the answer? Paul?
99% certain no. Clearly need to do more trials on this, but my underlying fear is it removes incentive to work and also removes autonomy and agency. So the real question is not UBI yes or no, it's what consequence will automation have in the lower paid sections of the economy, which are mainly occupied by the unskilled. What will the impact of that be, and what are then the solutions? That isn't necessarily a universal basic income for all of us, me included.
Thank you very much. And now I'm just going to turn to a really interesting question I'd like Steve to answer. I actually directed at you from Chris Hollins. And he says, Steve, how can the value associated with QE, so he's not disputing QE, but the value associated with QE be extended to the lowest income groups?
So this is a really important question, and I've slightly answered it to Kevin Langford, which I've put in the chat. But so obviously it's possible to have gifts and deliberate social payments, and we can be clear about the ethics of those. But normally in a just monetary economy, a market economy, you should be exchanging value for value. And the purpose of money is to enable indirect exchange, right? So that I, as a software engineer, don't need to find somebody who needs a program written in order to buy groceries. I just buy them. Everybody, I think, here will understand that's the purpose of money. But even though money enables indirect exchange, for it to be just and moral, it still needs to enable exchange of value for value. Well, okay, if we're going to break that rule and say we're going to print money, create money out of nothing and just give it to people as a social payment, well, then that's a conversation we can have, but we've got to have it being really clear what we're doing. Because at the moment, effectively what we've done with, say, furlough, which is incredibly important, I have to support it as a matter of force majeure, my constituents need it, but what is happening is that the Bank of England is creating the money borrowed indirectly by the government through markets, and then that's being spent as a social payment, but it results in a liability which has to be in some sense repaid later. But it's all just too complicated for us all to understand. So I suppose the answer to this is how one could do it. Well, you could end up, and in fact, a libertarian called Jesus Huerta de Soto in his monetary reform does suggest that the central bank should have direct control of the monetary system. And if they selected 2% a year monetary growth, that 2% could be used to finance welfare. So, people do have these ideas, but I can't possibly give a satisfactory answer to all the ethics involved now. All I can really say is thank you to people for listening and asking these questions, because they're super important. I would just say if I may, on the universal basic income question, I agree with Paul. I think the level of a universal basic income, if it was paid to everybody, would be far too low to be useful. I think it would be inflationary. And actually, I think it misses, if I may say so, the fundamental point is we want to help people in poverty. So what I would like to do is sort out universal credit. And by sort out, I mean things like get rid of the problem of advances that have to be repaid and increase the level of universal credit, but not extend it to everyone.
Thank you very much. Fantastic stuff to follow on. Becky, can you don't have to answer all, it's not possible. We've only got a couple more minutes, but couple of ideas, any general reflections you'd like to take from the conversation that the MPs have been so good to help in?
Yeah, well, just on that last point, I think one of the most fascinating things about the universal basic income idea is how popular it is. People really like the idea, and we need more ideas that have that same grabbing power, despite the fact that it all gets very technical when you start delving into the effects on particular labour markets or groups. And I'd also like to make a point about work disincentives as well. So everybody says in theory that housing benefit and universal basic incomes and other things create work disincentives in theory. And it seems obvious that they must, but actually there's no evidence on how that works in practice. So nobody knows how claimants approach this set of incentives they're given. And we can be sure they don't do it entirely rationally because no one can fully understand the system. So any claims we make in future about work disincentives or incentives from different benefit systems or need to be backed up by some actual research with actual people.
Well, on this point, I'd like to draw a line under our first seminar in our Conservatives Against Poverty, or Tories Against Poverty, our Conservative Anti-Poverty Month. I found it a fascinating discussion, and thank you, Bob, Paul, and Steve. It's been what I hoped it would be, conversation at scale, kind of brave ideas, thought through ideas, and very exciting. What we're going to do is we've got seminar, I think, next week, which I'd ask you all to come and join us at. And we will continue to discuss all of the issues that are confronting us. This seminar has been recorded. We will produce these ideas in the form of a book. And I would like to thank you all for joining us. Our next seminar is on the inequalities of place. And I've opened the remarks by saying how place and class have combined. My colleague Mike has posted the link for you all. So thank you so very much, and I look forward to speaking with you further. Have a great rest of the week, and thank you, Becky, for your thoughts and reflections. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.